From fabulous Las Vegas, Nevada, this is Pod Therapy, real people, real problems, and real therapists. You can submit your questions anonymously at podtherapy.net or email us at podtherapyguys@gmail.com. All right, it's been a rough week in America. Let's just have a good show. Let's focus on mental health. Don't get political. Don't get political. Don't get political.
But this is also a mental illness problem. If you look at both of these cases, this is mental illness.
God damn it! Fine, let's do this. We're here at Level 9 Studios. I'm Nick. That's Jim. Buckle up, America. It's time for some pod therapy.
It is time. So we are here to bring healing to the world this time. It's a lot on our shoulders.
This has always been my mission with this show.
Yeah.
Is I don't want to get political with stuff.
Yeah.
And yet we keep getting dragged into this.
Yeah. Well, we started the show during the Trump presidency.
That's true.
So we've had stuff going on.
That's true.
But no, and I think that for the most part, the folks that listen to our show, they know that we've generally sidestepped getting involved in any food fighting. We don't do it. And in fact, we've actually gotten praise before for being pretty fair, about any time that politics has shown up.
Right.
But at this point, this is one of those rare moments when we did not step toward the conversation. The conversation fell on us.
Right. And we have it all over. And it's all over us, and we got to shake this off.
We have to do it. And so, as you already played in that opening clip, let's review. So here we are in August. And there have been yet two more mass shootings in America that have taken just dozens of human lives. The first was in El Paso, Texas. And then that same day, only hours later, I think it was in that evening, there was another one in Dayton, Ohio. And so this just, I think, a week after the Garlic Fest shooting.
Right.
And then so many more. And so the conversation about mass shootings is a constant one that's always beating in the background, I think, of American politics and in our news cycles because they are so frequent. And there's always this underlying question of, well, gosh, why is it so frequent in America? But when two mass shootings happened on two different parts of the continent on the same day, it really raised all the alarms.
Right.
And it brought this conversation right to the front. And it also brought President Trump right to the front. And as you already played in that clip, I think that clip is him talking outside of the helicopter. Yeah, Marine One. But in his speech, he very specifically said mental illness pulled the trigger.
Right.
Not a gun. And so he's trying to make the case. It is very specifically a mental illness problem that is causing mass shootings in America. And he also said very specifically, it's a violent video games problem.
Right.
Now, in all fairness, to give the man his due, he did talk about, he alluded to creating some kind of bipartisan bill that would increase background checks, which would be about guns very specifically. But the conversation nationally has now been, is gun violence in America, is specifically mass shooters and active shooters, is that a mental illness problem? And that's what we find ourselves talking about today.
Yeah, that's kind of how it landed on our doorstep. And obviously, how does it get on our doorstep? Obviously, a big part of this is political because then mental health becomes an easy target to shift this onto so we don't have to talk about other issues that are a lot more polarizing.
It is.
Which is, honestly, if And you actually tweeted about this earlier today. I saw this where you're kind of like, all right, let's call his bluff.
Right. Oh, you saw that?
Yeah. Okay. If it is a mental health issue, what are you going to do?
Great.
How are you going to deal with that?
Yeah. It's a mental health issue, right?
Sure.
It's mentally ill people, right? Do you want me to screen them?
Yeah.
Line up. Yeah.
Right.
I would love that job. I mean, there you go. I've solved it, America. All you have to do is you cannot purchase a weapon in America unless you have been screened and approved by a licensed therapist. Done. And you know what else we've just fixed? Mental health care. Because now we've just financed everybody.
Right.
Because if you want to buy a gun, you first got to go see a shrink. Great. They made money and now they're available to do other work. And now we can pre-screen everybody. And you know what would be even better than that? You have to renew your license. So you have to have a license to have a gun and you have to get it renewed every year. Anyway, so obviously that was me trying to be facetious and call out Trump's bluff. But okay, so In today's episode, later in the show, we are going to have a special guest, and our guest is somebody who advocates for bringing together the conversations among those who are very much part of gun culture and proudly own their guns and believe very strongly in the Second Amendment and are resistant to any new legislation which might further restrict or inhibit their abilities to own guns. And the professional clinical community, Nick and I, this gentleman is going to talk about what his organization is doing to fuse those two tribes together so that they're both having a more robust conversation. But before we pivot to him, before we bring him onto the show, we need to specifically address this conversation. Is the reason that we have mass shootings in America, is it due to mental illness? Or is it due to violent video games? Or is it perhaps, just maybe, more complicated than both of those things?
If only there was some, I don't know, research that we could turn to.
Science would be so helpful right now. Oh my gosh, Nick.
Oh, look at that.
Look, I've got papers. I got papers right here that make paper sounds into the microphone. Yay.
Let's do this.
Here's the deal. So in episode 26 of my favorite podcast, Pod Therapy, when we were young and idealistic, before we were jaded. And actually, that is the very same episode where we announced Scoop Fest. I went back and listened to it.
Oh, was it?
It was the same episode we announced Scoop Fest, and the same episode we had our very first letter submitted by a Scoop. So we had already appeared on Matt Mattingly's Ice Cream Social. So really cool. But flashback in time, you go back to episode 26, the FBI had released a report that was very specifically about the psychology of active shooters.
Right.
And the entire report was just trying to figure out, hey, is there a pattern? Can we predict these folks? Are there any precursor behaviors or conditions which ultimately give us some predictive ability to know that a person might be at risk to become a shooter? Now, the report, which is what you heard me, waving in front of the microphone, I have linked to all on Twitter. It will be linked in the description of this episode if you would like to download it and read it. It is not intimidating. It is only like 30 pages. It is a very simple report, has lots of pretty graphs and lots of pretty colors. But it basically, in a very simple format, just explains, are there shooter demographics? Is it a certain type of human that does this? That answer was no. And I'll save you some reading. Nope, shooters look just like Americans in every way, except they tend to be male. How much planning and preparation goes into it? They do a lot of research on that. How do they buy their firearms? Do they get them illegally or legally? Spoiler alert, they buy them legally, right? And so there was a big section of the reports on page 17. And that section is just about mental health. Now, if you didn't know any better, you'd think that the FBI wrote this report specifically to address what Donald Trump said. In his speech, President Trump said, mental illness pulled the trigger, not guns. Right? Was that what he said?
No, it is.
Yeah.
Which, even if we ignore the fact that is absolutely asinine.
Yeah.
That a gun is going to pull a trigger.
Yeah. The gun didn't pull the trigger.
Skipping over that.
Pathology did. The invisible illness of the mind pulled the trigger. So anyway, the rhetoric aside, I'm holding in front of me page 17. This is from the FBI, and they studied for 13 years all the active shooters that they could. And the FBI has piles of information on you, on me, and absolutely piles of information from every possible angle on anybody who's ever committed a mass shooting. They have subpoenaed everything from Facebook to family records to everything, okay? Now, very specifically, I want to read just a few lines from this report. The report did talk about mental health, very broadly speaking, being what the report talks about as a stressor. And the report was very careful to point out, hey, these folks that are doing these things, they are under stressors. And that could be financial stressors, it could be employment stressors, family stressors, it could be substance abuse and alcohol, it could be violent media, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And it did identify that mental health was the top stressor that folks were under. And it identified that 62% of those that had committed a mass shooting, which is more than half, did have the stressor of mental health. But it does say this. It says the stressor mental health indicates that the active shooter appeared to be struggling with, most commonly, things like depression, anxiety, paranoia, etc. in their daily life in the year before the attack. Right. Now, you might hear that and go, holy cow, those who struggle with depression, anxiety, and paranoia are 62% likely to do some kind of mass shooting. That's not what it's saying.
No.
It's saying that 62% of the people who committed a mass shooting had, in the last year, experienced depression, anxiety, or paranoia. Listener, ask yourself, in the last year, have you ever experienced depression? Have you had anxiety? Have you ever felt paranoid? Okay, you would qualify by that report.
I mean, the same percentage of people have also probably used public transportation in the last year.
Exactly. It is
so that's not a predictor.
And this is why the report goes on to say, in this context, it is exceedingly important to highlight that the FBI could only verify that 25% of the active shooters had been diagnosed by a mental health professional with a mental illness of any kind prior to the offense. So while 63% seem to have experienced depression or anxiety, like you can kind of tell in their postings and things like that, only 25% really legitimately had a mental illness that was diagnosed. Now, the report also goes on to say, in light of the very high lifetime prevalence of the symptoms of mental illness among the U.S. population, formally diagnosed mental illness is not a very specific predictor of violence of any type, let alone targeted violence. Some studies indicate that nearly half of the U.S. population experiences symptoms of mental illness over their lifetime, with population estimates of the lifetime prevalence of diagnosable mental illness among U.S. adults at 46%. So 46%, according to some studies, is how many adults in the U.S. could be diagnosed with mental illness. By that rate, active shooters are half as likely to have a mental illness as you, the listener, are, or as me, or as Nick, or as anybody else. To put it as the FBI did, final statement on this from the report, and then I'll stop quoting it. The last line in the mental health section of the report, the FBI said this. In short, here's the full text of it. Therefore, absent specific evidence, careful consideration should be given to social and contextual factors that might interact with any mental health issue before concluding that an active shooting was, quote, caused by mental illness. In short, declarations that all active shooters must simply be mentally ill are misleading and unhelpful. That report could have been written as a response.
Yeah, absolutely.
To what the president said. And so, as clearly as I can make this plain to you, it is not merely Jim's opinion that mental illness is not what pulls the trigger in an active shooter situation. It is the opinion of the FBI's exhaustive analysis of active shooters in conjunction with mental health professionals.
Right.
That mental health is not the best predictor of an active shooter.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny. When was that written?
That was written, I think it was we read it the year that it was released. So that would be last year. 2018.
Yeah. And it fits perfectly with exactly what we're talking about.
It does. So again, the other thing that President Trump said may have been responsible for these shooters was violent video games. He said, it's mental illness that did this. And then he went on to say it's a culture of violent video games. So, Nick,
right.
you kind of took a look at that to help us understand the correlation, if any, that there is with violent video games and mass shootings. Yeah.
So part of my job a couple years ago, working with youth, we worked with video game addiction. So not necessarily specific with aggression, but with video game addiction. And so a lot of this I was already kind of familiar with, but I decided to dig into this a little bit more. And there's quite a few problems with the claim.
Right.
So number one, problems with correlation. So we're retroactively assuming connections that were there. So we see this all the time in reports that the shooter was known to play Call of Duty, or the shooter practiced his shooting skills on blank video game, or whatever. Right. But the problem is when you factor in the numbers,
right,
you can't. That's useless information.
Right.
97% of American kids play video games.
Yeah.
So that's the equivalent of 64 million kids between the ages of 2 to 17 that play video games.
That therefore, if they ever became the shooter, you'd say, there it is. That's what caused. That's like saying learning to play baseball. Well, is correlated with the hand-eye coordination necessary to be a mass shooter.
More than half of the top 50 video games selling contain violence.
Right.
So Patrick Markey, he's the PhD director of the Interpersonal Research Laboratory at Villanova.
Oh, Patrick.
Right.
Yeah.
Good.
Patty. We call him Patty.
Friend of the show.
Friend of the show.
he basically broke this down and said 90% of young males play video games. Finding that a young man who committed a violent crime also played a popular video game such as Call of Duty, Halo, or Grand Theft Auto is as pointless as pointing out that the criminal also wore socks.
Right. It's that common.
Right.
It's that irrelevant. So your first point is it's not a strong case that violent video games are the reason we have mass shootings, in part because it's just the correlation error that a lot of people make who do not study issues generally, who don't use science. That first error is a correlation error.
Right.
And that's what the data says.
Another correlation error is the trends. People tend to assume that our culture is becoming more and more violent as video games increase.
Okay.
The research doesn't support that.
So culture itself is not necessarily becoming more and more violent, even as the video games are absolutely becoming more and more violent.
As the sale of violent video games has been increasing, violent juvenile crime rates have significantly decreased.
Wow.
So from 94 to 2014, video game hardware and software increased 204%.
Yeah.
While violent crimes decreased 37%, and murders by juveniles acting alone fell 76%.
That is devastating to this argument. If you're trying to tell me that violent video games are the reason we have mass shooters, then I should see a swell of violence among teenagers all across the country. Instead, we're seeing the inverse. We're
Naturally,
seeing less.
we would anticipate that would increase.
And they said the same thing about hard rock. They said the same thing about like heavy metal. That like, oh, that's angry music, and now all the kids are going to do this.
And that was another point that was brought up in a lot of the research that I was looking at, is just this whole idea that we have, and it tends to be a generational thing where older generations view anything new from newer generations as being harmful.
Right.
Right. So I actually have some data on that as well.
About how old people don't like your fancy music.
No, a study in the psychology of popular media and culture in October 2013 found that people who have no experience playing video games were 6 times more likely to believe the games contributed to mass shootings. Wow. So it's one of those things where
I totally believe that because it's you hear about the video game, you have not played it. Right. Like, and that's the thing. Like this challenge has happened with my wife and I because we have a 9-year-old son, and I've let him play like Halo with me, and she hears all the gunshots and stuff, and she comes over, she's like, "Is this okay? Like, is this?" And I'm like, "Yeah, it really is." And she's like, "Well, I mean, how do you know?" And I look at her, I'm like, "I'm a therapist. I'm the most qualified person in this house to decide if this kid's going to play this video game. He's going to be fine."
And we're seeing the same trend all over as far as students becoming less violent and less physically aggressive. So the number of high school students who have been in at least one physical fight in the past year has decreased from 43% in 91 to 25% in 2013.
So the trends are people who play violent video games, they are not necessarily committing violence. We're not seeing an increase in violence.
Correct.
So the mass shooters may have also played those games, and they may have also, like, chewed Trident.
Well, and
like that's too, not the thing.
They also look at, like when I think it was Sandy Hook in that shooting. One of the things that they looked at, like right away, the news broke that this kid was playing a lot of video games.
Yeah.
And so they automatically assumed that this is kind of as a contributor to the mass shooting.
And he also had autism.
Well, and the other thing is the video game that he was playing was Dance Dance Revolution.
Wow. And nobody wanted to comment on the fact that he's a dancing machine, and that has nothing to do with violence.
Right.
Fantastic.
So now here's the other side of this argument. So as I've been watching the news, I've kind of been glued to the news for the last 48 hours, like most Americans. I'm seeing a lot of folks are tweeting saying, there's absolutely no connection. There's no connection between violent video games and aggressive behavior. No connection between violent video games and mass shooting.
Okay.
Those are two different arguments.
Right.
Violent video games and mass shootings, correct. There is no scientific data or research that supports that connection.
Right.
There is some scientific data that does support violent video games with aggression.
Yes.
So we've talked about it on this show. Dr. Doug Gentile from Iowa State University.
Dougie. Oh, Doug.
Runs another big fan of the show.
D-Money.
He runs a lab at ISU and has spent a lot of time addressing this.
Yeah.
But even he will admit that in his research, when looking at aggression, it's hard to relate in the lab aggression to real world aggression.
Right. It's not a one-to-one.
Exactly.
thing.
So you can't do a research study and then throw the kids in the octagon.
And find out
act.
how hard they punch. Because if you're doing a lab experiment, it's like whether or not they slammed their chair whenever they like tucked it under the table.
Ultimately,
mark them for aggression.
Ultimately, what they have to do with these studies is they have to use proxy measures of aggression.
Right.
So, like, do we see bullying behavior, or in this situation,
is it a subtle uptick in aggression?
Will this kid choose to put hot sauce in this other kid's drink or beverage or something like that? So, while we may see a connection between the video game and that aggressive behavior, we can't say that aggressive behavior relates to anything in the outside world.
That is a far cry from mass murder. Right.
Another thing that was really interesting is there was a study done at Dartmouth University, and Dr. Christopher Ferguson and Dr. Patrick Markey, who we talked about earlier,
Chris and Patty,
wrote a book about this, and they kind of refuted a lot of the studies or a lot of this that was going on with this particular study, and they were talking about overt physical aggression. So the Dartmouth University claimed a link to violent video games with youth aggression. Their data focused on self-reported behaviors and thoughts.
Okay.
So the youth answered questions such as, have I become so mad that I have broken things?
Okay.
Or,
dude, I've thrown some controllers
so
in my
have
day. Yeah.
When I was
they don't make them strong enough anymore.
When I was a kid.
The SNES controllers have flown.
Yeah, the Nintendo controller that I had, like I broke both of them. So I had to use that big one that had the joystick and the two buttons because I broke the other ones.
Yeah.
And then also asking questions like, or addressing other things like, what was the other thing that they asked? I lost my spot now, but if I had to resort to violence to protect my rights, will I do that?
Okay.
So it's all self-reported data and not based off of behavior.
And so even though there's some data that says, hey, violent video games might correlate with microaggression, that in no way would correlate to it. That's like saying hip hop music correlates to, having sex with your spouse. And then trying to extrapolate from that, therefore hip hop leads to rape. And it's like, whoa, like you took a huge jump in a different direction.
Now, here's the other really important thing to consider is a lot of these studies don't factor in competitive nature.
Okay. Oh, that's a good point.
A peer-reviewed study in the psychology of violence in August of 2011 determined that the competitive nature of a video game was related to aggressive behavior regardless of whether the game contained violent content or not. So the researchers concluded that because past studies have failed to equate the violent and non-violent video games on competitiveness, difficulty, and pace of action simultaneously, researchers may have attributed too much of the variability and aggression to the violent content.
Let me tell you how I know that's true. I play a video game called Rocket League, okay? There's no rockets. It's cars. It's cars playing soccer. It's soccer cars, okay? It's big in Europe, and it's big in the Jobin house, okay? Nobody dies. It's just cars. And dude, I am pissed 100% of the time. My family has made a rule that I'm only allowed to play after everybody's in bed because I am just angry the whole time because I lose and because it's very competitive and it's nail-bitey and suspenseful and it's a mess. It's a mess. So I absolutely agree with that. So that's interesting because that last study you just talked about pretty much just ended the conversation about, is there a correlation? Yeah, there's a little bit of a correlation with aggression, but whenever you factor out violence and just leave in competitiveness, yep, there's still a correlation with aggression. That's Occam's razor at work. That's the most simple explanation. So far, here's what we've done on the show. We've taken these two mass shootings. We have taken President Trump's initial reaction to that, in which he basically said the two biggest factors that explain this mass shooting are specifically mental illness, that pulled the trigger, and specifically violent culture in video games. And so far, using FBI data and using scientific research, we've gone ahead and explained those don't hold water. Now, mental illness is absolutely a factor, and this is what I think is tricky, though, right? Because when somebody commits suicide, we will ex post facto diagnose that person with depression. So if somebody commits suicide and then you come ask me, hey, did that person have depression? I'm very likely to tell you, inherently, yes. Inherently, the evidence that that person did have depression before they completed suicide is the action of suicide, right? And so I can see the argument that maybe inherently by the action of a mass shooting, you have demonstrated out your lived mental illness. I don't buy it because then every soldier has to have mental illness by the action that they have completed. And I don't feel that that's accurate. I think suicide is in a special bucket of I killed myself. It's probably evidence of depression.
Right. And plus how you can't say if a crime or a mass shooting was race related.
Right.
That's a mental health
yeah,
issue.
And
you can't
it overbroadens this concept of mental health to now encompass anything that's bothersome to you. Racism gets to live in its own bucket. Socio-political philosophy gets to live in its own bucket. Neither of those has anything to do with mental illness. Even if you find them distasteful, they exist on their own. And that gets to be its own thing. If somebody has a diagnosed mental illness, as this report said, 25% of shooters have had that, which is still less than the American population. That is telling that this is not the problem. So earlier in the show, when we were first starting, we teased that we've got a special guest with us in studio. He's sitting right here. Michael Sodini from Walk the Talk America. Hi, Mike. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. This is awesome. I'm a big fan of you guys.
Thanks, brother. We're excited to have you. So tell us about Walk the Talk America. Tell us about what your organization's trying to do.
Okay, so I'm a third generation Sodini in the firearms industry, but I grew up in San Francisco, New Jersey. So I didn't name myself this, but people call me the ungun gun guy.
The ungun gun guy.
Right.
Okay.
Like the theory is people always say, you don't act like a gun guy.
Okay.
You don't carry yourself like a gun guy.
Okay. But you are a gun guy.
I am a gun guy.
Yeah,
yes.
But the ungun gun guy.
Yes.
Not a stereotypical gun guy. I think I'm following.
Yeah. So, I did a chance meeting. I was at a dinner in Louisiana, and we invited someone to eat dinner with us, my national sales manager. And she knew nothing about firearms. She didn't have a problem with firearms. She was like, hey, look, I'm neutral. But she said, how does the mass shooting thing work? And I said, well, everyone blames the gun. We blame mental health. And it just goes in a circle. Nothing happens.
Sure.
Life-changing moment. She looks at us and she's like, since you guys have identified the problem, you guys must work hand in hand with mental health.
Oh, as gun people, she's saying, you must obviously have a partnership with mental health people.
Exactly. And we were about 11 vodka sodas deep.
Okay.
And
that's when epiphanies take place.
And it hit me in the face. And what's funny is as we were leaving, we invited her to keep coming with us. And she'd be like, no, I have a conference tomorrow. And she looked at me and she's like, you're really going to do this? Because my national sales manager turned to me and he's like, we really should be giving like $1 a gun to mental health. It was a very general statement.
Sure.
But it made sense to me because I had those relationships in the firearms industry.
Wow.
And
that makes so much sense. Before, we started this podcast and stuff, I was once the president of an organization called the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI. A lot of folks have heard about it. And there was a point when we were actually talking about connecting with the NRA, because we knew that the NRA was very much trying to say, hey, guys, please don't think it's just guns here. Let's talk about the bigger picture. And at the time, we wanted NAMI to step up and say, okay, if you guys are serious about that, let's see the money. If you want this to be a bigger conversation, let's join forces. So that's kind of where Walk the Talk America steps into that void and says, okay, we are pro-gun people, in your case, and we want to be partners with mental health people.
Right.
So what does the organization want to do?
Well, so the story is I wrote this Jerry Maguire Hail Mary email to Mental Health America because I found a position paper 72.
Yeah.
And they responded. It worked out.
Okay.
I'm doing the short version for time constraints, right? So I walked in the door saying, look, we can work together. I was naive at the time. I would say things like crazy with a gun. I didn't realize my language. Sure. I didn't realize the whole industry's language was off. But we worked together, and then we moved towards policies and programs together that are beneficial from a mental health state. Not about, at first I thought it was about, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to catch the next mass shooter.
Okay. Right. And kind of turn them around.
Right.
Yeah.
But what I walked in on here, notice you guys are already like 3 steps ahead of the conversation, right?
Yeah.
So what I learned is that I started talking to mental health professionals, people like Dr. Jeffrey Swanson from Duke University. Got to meet some really nice people that, they were like, hey, focus on suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, no, I want to catch the next mass shooter. I didn't realize it was finding the needle in the haystack.
Right.
So cut 2, we had developed a relationship with Mental Health America. We developed our own programs. We're changing the language in the 2A community. Like I'm
2A community. What does that mean?
The Second Amendment community, gun culture.
Gun culture. Okay.
Like, so people do shows like this, and
Yeah.
They're saying, Mike's going to be mad at me because I said, lunatic with a gun, or they said committed. See, I'm starting to correct.
Sure. There's a language thing. Yeah.
Right. And that's one of the promises I made to Mental Health America. Is like, if we're going to stand together in front of everybody, I'm going to go against my people. Mental Health America is going to go against their people. And I hate separating. I really do. But
we're going to challenge each other's tribes. Okay.
We're going to call each other the carpet. We're going to educate each other. We have to.
Okay.
Right. So that's been the great part. But it's been a wild 1 year. But there's programs that we have that we're building within the community, the 2A community out, which I think will just contribute to a better mental health of America, if you will. One of the things that we do is we do things like this. I brought some cards. Now,
okay, so you're handing us a flyer here, and it says, Walk the Talk America, mental health. It's okay to talk about it. Everyone has it. Some might need help with it. Walk the Talk America is with you. So your target audience, who do you hope will hold one of these cards and realize it's okay to talk about mental health?
We put those in firearms boxes.
You put them in firearms boxes?
Yes, we have companies like Bursa, Metro Arms, which is American Classic, MAC, SPS, High Point, Arms Corps. Arms Corps is a Las Vegas or Pahrump firearms manufacturer. So our thing is let's cut things off. Let's cast a wide net.
Okay.
Make people have or give people access to mental health. That leads to screenings.
Right.
WTTA.org/love. With our partnership with Mental Health America, that leads to screenings where you can go and take an anonymous free screening for things like anxiety, depression, PTSD.
And so you're specifically trying to put these you're putting them in firearms that are sold, or in the case, I imagine, the packaging.
Mm-hmm.
And so the person who just purchased a firearm is also opening up their box and seeing Walk the Talk America free material that says, hey, there's absolutely no shame in being a human who needs help. It's okay to find a helper, and you can follow this link for an anonymous check-in.
Absolutely. And if you look at the 2A community, Second Amendment people, we suffer the most because we're afraid to lose our gun rights. We're afraid to lose clearance, our jobs, everything like that. First responders, we had just, 5 or 7, I think it's up to 7 people at NYPD take their own lives.
Yeah.
So we need it the most.
Yeah.
But once again, it's casting that wide net out there to show people you bought a firearm, you're going to be a responsible gun owner, lock it up.
Right.
And then also, here's where you can go get help if you need help or you think you need help.
I think that's really relevant in a sense, especially because Mental Health America was challenging you to think firstly about suicide. One of the best predictors that we have scientifically of somebody doing suicidal behavior is if they possess a gun, which obviously, we don't want that to conflate with therefore guns are evil. It's just access. It's just, It's a very efficient way to end a life. That's the design of this tool. It can do that. So to put this right in there to say, hey, you just purchased a gun, and by the way, if you're ever depressed or worried about yourself, it's okay to get checked in with. That's all right. So is the mission of Walk the Talk America to sort of be the bridge between therapists and what you call the 2A community? Is that kind of the design of the intention of the mission here?
The mission keeps growing.
Okay.
And that's the fun thing about Walk Talk America is where we are from a year ago when I just wanted to hand money to mental health professionals.
Right.
To where we are now with our own policy.
We will take your money, Mike.
No, I know.
We're fine with it.
I know. Mental Health America has already proven that.
They will take that money.
They have already proved that to me.
But has Mental Health America brought you on their podcast, Mike? Okay, I'm just saying. Pod Therapy, we like you.
But I wanted to touch on one thing. First of all, the Second Amendment industry, or
movement,
movement, the community, we can do better.
Okay.
And I'll be the first person to say that. We can do better. I think the NRA has done a horrible job. But I have board members that are single-handedly in trying to change that whole philosophy. So we can police our own. It starts from within. And I'm only giving you this short, quick version.
Sure.
But one of the things that I did want to talk about, and I think you guys will like, because Jake Wiskerson.
Yeah, we know Jake.
Okay. Yeah. Jake is
a real friend of the show.
He's a real friend of the show.
Everybody else
is make-believe friends of the show. Jake's for real.
So Jake and I, 2 weeks ago in Reno, Nevada, held the first ever intersection of firearms and therapy. Continuing education course.
Right.
So we had 14 licensed therapists come into the range. Many of them had never shot a firearm before.
So you actually brought in therapists. Jake led a workshop, and the goal was to help a therapist familiarize themselves with a firearm.
Right.
What is the purpose of that?
So in the community, we think that clinicians are there to take your firearms, right, and strip you of your rights. So if you go in and you say, "I don't feel well," like we're
going to take your gun,
coming through the window, right? And on the flip side of that, there are many therapists that don't understand why we want to own firearms or how we tick.
Sure.
So it's bringing two worlds that have there's a stigma to both, right? Mental health and firearms, and bringing them together. And, it's like two pieces of a puzzle coming together.
Sure.
We'll never get over believing that you guys can take our guns if we don't talk about it. Because then when you talk to therapists, like Jake will be like, I don't even know how that's possible.
Right. We don't actually possess the power to take your guns.
Right. And there's certain states such as New York and New Jersey where, maybe it's a little different.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm here for, is to say to Mental Health America, hey, I'm telling, you go after that. Go after the SAFE Act.
Right.
Because mental health diagnosis does not predict future violence, only previous violence.
Right.
Right. So it's things like that.
Okay. No, I follow it. And so, as a clinician, I guess I do agree with this in principle. I like the idea that there's an organization that's trying to speak to those who own guns, who may become a culture unto themselves, who might feel intimidated or falsely afraid of therapists. And so your organization is building that bridge toward them. And simultaneously, you're partnering with clinicians like Jake Wiskerson and saying, I want to make sure that you therapists don't have any wrong ideas about those who own guns. It would be inaccurate for you to think that we're all scary people. Here's what we really believe, and here's what we want you guys to understand about us, and here's the way you can best reach us. Is that kind of what the mission is?
Well, it's twofold. It's for us as well. It's for my people. Once again, it's a separation. I can't stand it. But we need a sort of a green book as well. Places that actually can advertise. Like my thought process is, why can't therapists say, hey, 2A friendly or Second Amendment,
don't be afraid.
Gun culture, just like airline pilots, LGBTQ, list those categories, especially like on Psychology Today. For me, we need places to go where we can feel safe and talk about how the firearm sometimes saves our lives.
Yeah.
In the sense that if you talk to a lot of soldiers, the range and shooting is what actually saves their life, as opposed to some people are like, if I had access to a firearm, I wouldn't be here telling the story.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's bringing the two worlds together to say, look, it's okay to get help. And you don't have to have a scarlet A on your chest the rest of your life.
Right.
Just because 6 years ago you went through a bad breakup and maybe you did something, you cut your arms or, stuff like that. That shouldn't define you.
Right.
So it's bringing two people together that don't talk. If you look at the shirt I'm wearing, and I know this is a show and your readers can't. I made this shirt because it's two puzzle pieces. Yeah. You have gun culture and then you have the mental health community. Yeah. You have the stereotypes, everything that people think. And what it is kicking down that door. I came late to the party. So the Trump stuff, that killed me that he was saying that. Like, come on. We've been doing this a year and we still have people inside the community that talk like that. So we have to get rid of that language. We have to bridge out and then figure out how to work together on stuff that actually saves lives. It doesn't always even have to do with a gun, right? It's just about breaking down the stigma of mental health.
So, Mike, let me ask you this. When the president says, hey, everybody, the mass shooters are mentally ill, what, as a member of the 2A community, when you hear that, teach us how a 2A member is thinking. Are they hearing that and thinking, whoa, I'm not going to see a therapist I'm struggling with my marriage right now, but I'm not going to go in because I don't want them to think I'm the next mass shooter. Is that what they're thinking? Does it push people away from getting help?
Yeah, I think it's the fear of losing your right. Because what we do in the 2A community is we look at everything from the law-abiding citizen.
Okay, right. They don't want to be conflated with people that are breaking the law. These are the folks that are following the law.
Right. Okay. So, and to lose that right, that's important to us, or it's important to a lot of people.
Sure.
I go in there and I want to be able to say, I'm having my wife left me. I do have a firearm. It's locked up. I'm not a threat to myself.
Right.
But I have to develop that trust with you.
Yes.
And that's very difficult to do when the narrative of the 2A community, especially from the NRA, is, if they don't understand us, they're going to take our guns.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So one of the things that you had mentioned earlier is how you've got kind of a counterpart at Mental Health America and then yourself, and you are kind of challenging your own community's ideas and philosophies. As you've done that, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges that you've had in challenging the 2A community and how to think about mental health?
The language for sure was a big one, right? Because I had made a promise to Debbie Plotnick, who's the vice president of Mental Health America, that we'd stop saying things like it's a lunatic with a gun, or we try to omit the word commit.
Sure.
Just change the language to get the different thought process. That was tough, but now it's coming around, which is great.
Okay.
The second biggest thing is to get people to trust us. Now, I got lucky because I have some pretty heavy hitters of the industry behind me.
Yeah.
And
on your flyer, I can see that. There's a lot of companies, Eagle and Bursa.
Well, I used to own that company, and I sold it 2 months ago to do this full time.
Oh, wow. Oh. Okay. So these are gun companies.
Yes.
Yes.
So but I also have some really heavy hitters in the industry, guys like Coley Noir, who is he does a great job of not just speaking the typical narrative of the 2A community that can turn a lot of people off.
Okay.
Rob Pincus, he's someone that I did Jake knows Rob. We did the whole program together. He's an instructor.
Okay.
Famous in the industry. Educator. He was there to teach the shooting part of the course in Reno. Yeah.
Interesting. So you've got that. I kind of hear you saying that you've got that credibility in the community, that people know that you're for real and that you're one of them, and that you're bringing forth a good message, that it's okay, don't be afraid of the therapist. It's such an interesting thing, Mike, that we're interviewing a guy right now who's here to talk about how he's telling the people with guns, don't be afraid of the therapists, right? Whereas the rest of the country is more afraid of the people with guns. That's the stigma that they have to face.
Yes, and that's very true. But honestly, that's one of the great things about being the ungun gun guy. When I came into that world, the 2A community accepted me.
Right.
I grew up in Jersey and San Francisco. I was a city kid. Right? I was a punk kid. I'd never been around guns. I didn't go hunting. I didn't know, it was a totally different lifestyle. I still don't hunt. I mean, I still don't do things, but I saw how good the people were and where their heart's at.
Okay.
And that was something where I had more of a liberal background growing up, and then I was thrust into this thing, and it was about, I always thought, like, there are 10 things that hot topics. We could go abortion, we can go religion, we could go gun rights.
Right.
We could agree on 8 out of 10.
Okay.
Right. And that's really all that matters. So there might be one hot topic we don't disagree with, but that's not worth throwing away relationships or not making relationships.
Yeah.
Right. So you have to be able to go into a conversation, not get emotional, hear the other side. Like right now, if here I am and there's all these tragedies, and I look at it this way, I have to be able to tell people or let people tell me what the thought process is, get it off of their chest, what upsets them. I can't educate you unless I have a thought that doesn't require an emotional reaction. Right?
Okay.
I need you to come to me, tell me, hey, I hate guns.
Okay.
Okay. You shouldn't be able to. That's okay.
You'll hear that person out.
Yeah.
And I agree with that. And I've, over the past 48 hours, I've given this a lot of thought, because my whole philosophy in when there's a disagreement about something that's very politically charged, the way that I always try to approach it is I try to find the most convincing argument on the other side.
Okay,
and try to...
On opening arguments, they call that steel manning instead of straw manning. You steel man the other side to take their strongest bit and give them credit for it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I've really thought a lot about this, within the gun culture and the Second Amendment thing. I'm pretty... I wouldn't say I'm overly liberal, but I lean that way. I'm pretty on the left side. And so trying to understand, like, what's the most convincing argument that I can understand from the Second Amendment side. And I think for me, it's just the idea of that people enjoy that culture and just being able to shoot to having a gun, going to a range, being able to shoot at targets and stuff like that, and having no idea of like how this is like imagining like I'm killing a human being, but just being a gun enthusiast, just having a gun, enjoying it, and that being kind of a hobby. Like, and from that perspective, I can understand how you can perceive a threat from the opposite side of, they want to take this away. This is something that I really enjoy, and there's a fear that I'm going to lose it. Like, I don't have to understand exactly or even relate to what that's like to be in that community or to have that as a hobby, but I can understand what it's like to have a hobby and a fear of maybe it being taken away. I'm an avid golfer. Okay. Yeah. Now, if someone were to say, you know what, there's too many problems with golf. Golf is, let's just get crazy with this idea.
Okay. Yeah.
That golf is being used to hurt too many people.
Right.
And so now there's a threat that we're going to take away your golf clubs.
Yeah.
A part of me is going to be like, but I'm not doing that. I enjoy this hobby. This is something I really enjoy. Don't take this away from me. I do think that at some point I would have a breaking point and be like, all right, I kind of understand what's going on. I kind of understand that this is being a problem. Maybe I'm not. I don't think that my golf club should be taken away, but maybe before I go buy a new 3-wood, I'm okay with you guys doing a background check. Or I'm okay with something like that.
I just have to interject with one. So when I use, I like talking examples and analogies. I always use the fact that I don't golf, right? And the way I apply that is the 2A community has a tendency when people start talking about gun control or legislation, they just shut down and turn away and walk off.
Sure.
And then you have people that might write laws that don't care about firearms. I want to be part of that conversation. So if there's going to be a law, if we keep saying we're law-abiding 2A citizens, I want to be there when the laws are written so I can challenge in a nice way, why that doesn't make sense.
Right.
Let's just not make laws for feel-goods or emotional reactions, right? But I always use the example, if someone makes a law about golf and no one tells me, hey, people love golf. It's therapeutic. They love it. They like being out there. I might be like, 7-day waiting list if you want to golf? Sure, whatever. Check off. Right? So it cracks me up because I use the same thing in the opposite way.
So, all right, let me be Debbie Downer here for a second.
Sure.
I'll be the stinking liberal in the room. And not to punch holes in because I know that your golf analogy was not made flippantly, Nick. I know you're just trying your best to bridge the thought, and that's what steel manning is essentially trying your best to bolster an argument so that you can be very fair-minded and an attempt to understand the other side, which I'm all about. And, I think that that's actually the best strategy for discussion that can possibly exist. So, Mike, I don't want to put you into the seat of answering for all of America's problems. I'm not going to ask you to solve it. I'm not going to ask you to tell us the answer to the riddle. I don't expect any man, woman, or child in our country has the answer to everything that we're facing. But we're not talking about sporting equipment. Guns were not made for recreation. We are talking about a very specific piece of technology that is made to exacting and precise measurements that is designed to end organic life. That is what it is for. It is not the most common use of this tool in our country to go hunting. We have farms and ranches now. We buy our food at grocery stores. We no longer hunt anywhere to get it. Most of us don't. So whenever we bring up this argument that say, golly, the founders intended us to have this right because we shoot clay pigeons or we shoot deer on, out in the forest, and therefore everybody has to live with this ridiculous amount of mass shootings that happen every year that are using the same piece of technology to accomplish evil ends, it is a problem. It is a paradox that doesn't have an easy solution. So, Mike, I pass that to you. Here you are trying to run an organization that is trying to bridge the gap between people who proudly own their guns and would like to be left alone because they're law-abiding citizens and not conflated with those who are committing mass shootings, and the mental health community who would very much like mental or mass shooters to not be conflated with mental illness. Mm-hmm. And you're trying to join hands with both of those tribes. So let me put it to you. Why do we have mass shootings in America?
That is, if I could answer that one, that would be great.
You could be the next president if you can answer that one.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, if we're looking at it through President Trump's mentality, there's a whole lot of guns in our country, or maybe it's mental illness, or maybe it's video games. And you came in and heard the part where we said it's definitely not mental illness, it's definitely not video games. Other countries have mental illness, other countries have video games. They don't have the guns, they don't have the mass shootings. Now, I don't expect you as a 2A guy to say, great, take our guns. And I'm not here to say, great, take our guns. But I'm asking, would it be a fair reaction for a person in the 2A community to say, obviously, these weapons are the thing that people use to kill a lot of people? Maybe that's part of the conversation we need to have.
And if you're going to talk to a pure 2A guy, his knee-jerk reaction or response is going to be, you can rent a truck and drive it down the Las Vegas Boulevard at its crowdest day and wipe out a ton of people. Right? Mm-hmm. And that's not an answer that's always going to make people happy when they're asking, because they want to know the why, right? Because it's a tool of destruction. But then again, the 2A guy would also argue with you, there's value in firearms. So a lot of people collect them just as they do baseball cards because of the value. They're always looking for these unique guns. There's also shooting, recreational sports. There's competition shooting. There are other uses than the intended original Second Amendment right to defend yourself, right? It's hard to wrap your head around that, right? Because it's like, hey, if I don't hunt, I don't kill animals. That's something that that's from my liberal side. I brought that in. But as far as back to your original question, mass shootings, why are they happening? I think about this all the time. I have access to information that most people don't. And that's one of the great things about working with Mental Health America. The class we put on 2 weeks ago, that was awesome, because we had people in there that could ask questions and say, like, why is this so important? Why does that gun that looks so scary, the AR-15, we should ban that? You know, I don't have a problem with the handgun or the wooden rifle, not realizing that if you ban it on the principle of what the firearm is, semi-automatic, you're banning all firearms. Like, a lot of people don't understand that concept. So if I take this microphone, right, and I paint it, it has a wooden handle and it looks very safe. You know, I could say this is a microphone. Then I could actually make it black, make it look scary. I could put a stock on it. I could do all these things. And then I'd say this is an assault microphone. It changes the perception of that weapon.
Okay.
Right. So part of this doesn't answer your question about mass shootings, but part of it is the misunderstanding of what you're looking at and really understanding it. But back to your question, what I think the problem is, and I don't think it's video games, I don't think it's movies. I watched, most of my friends have never heard of Fly, and we played a ton of violent video games, and we watched a ton of violent movies.
And in fairness, Mike, you're allowed to say, I don't know.
Well, no. I have a lot of good discussions about this, because I think about this. There used to be less gun restrictions in the United States, and there were more automatic weapons out there. Why didn't we have these massive shootings like in the 60s and 70s and, 80s? We did have mass shootings, but you used to be able to get automatic weapons fairly easy. Mm-hmm. And when I say automatic, for the listening crowd, let's just go through the difference between semi-automatic and automatic. Semi-automatic is what the shooters used this weekend, which is one pull of the trigger, one shot.
Okay.
Automatic is when you pull the trigger and it rapid fires numerous bullets.
Okay.
It's much faster. End result, same, right? So it doesn't take it away, but that's been the problem, having the dialogue. For most people, they don't know what semi-automatic versus automatic is. Like, I was watching TMZ yesterday, and Coley Noir, one of my board members, was on there having a great time talking to Harvey, but they couldn't get over the semi-automatic automatic thing.
Okay.
I think Coley Noir did a horrible job of educating, but he wasn't there to do that. So he was just like, essentially, you're saying ban all firearms. The 22 little planking gun and the AR have the same function when it comes to semi-automatic.
Okay. One
shot, one pull. But I said, what changed in the world, right? I don't know. Maybe it could be, maybe it's the passing of information so fast, right? Maybe it's the world's getting really small. We can, if we wanted to, guys, today we could hop on a plane and get to France. Back in the day, you didn't leave your community. You didn't have news at your fingertips. I don't know. Maybe that changed the course of the way things are. The internet, being able to be influenced, much more. You had more tight communities. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know what it is.
Well, I mean, I'll just complete my thought by saying we said this at the opening of the show. Pod Therapy is not a political platform. It is not a place where we advocate for specific policy. The heart and soul and intention of our show is that a person who's on the listening end of the speaker might hear our message and say, you know what, I might want to check in with a therapist, and it's okay for me to get help too. And to that extent, Mike, I think you and I have a great amount of overlap because I think we both share the desire to see a hurting person, whether they possess a firearm or whether they do not, get help. And so that's your central message, is that if you own a firearm and you're afraid that a therapist is going to take it, your message is, guys, that's not how this works. It's okay to get help. Yeah.
To me, no matter how many topics I disagree with you guys on, if there's any, we don't even know that yet, right? We can have a couple beers and go around a round table and figure that out. But one thing we all can fall back on, everybody in this room can fall back on, is we don't want to see people die, and we don't want to see people in crisis.
Yeah.
And I feel that the majority of people in the world actually feel that same way. There are places, where it could maybe get a little dicey if you're not from the area. But, for me, that's what we build on. If we build on that thought process and that theory, we come together on that. I know most people that disagree with firearms have they have good intentions, right? It has nothing to do with the fact that they don't like the firearm. Nobody wants to see a DUI wreck out there, So that's where we build. We build there.
Start with where we agree.
Right.
Yeah. And I would agree. I mean, in that sense, that's how all discussion should take place, is finding that point of agreement, because I'm sure you and I agree on a lot of things as far as, the range of weapons could go from owning a knife, like all the way to the extreme of an atomic bomb. And I'm sure both of us are on the same page that we would think Americans can own knives and no American should own an atomic bomb. Somewhere in between there's a line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And where we may disagree is where that line is, but we both agree that there is a line someplace in there. And what I'm hearing you say is that when these laws are made for drawing that line, that it's important to have this discussion, because the people who draw that line need to understand where that line is.
Where it gets problematic, right?
The difference between what is considered an automatic versus a semi-automatic, or what's considered, this type of weapon versus this. And it does become very gray. It becomes very confusing as to, what is the purpose of this weapon? Is this a sporting thing that you can use, target practicing, or is this a machine that's meant for war? And where do we draw that line between what should be allowed and where we need to have some really strict regulations on who can purchase this and what kind of process they need to go through to purchase this?
Yeah, and I know we have a time crunch here, but one of the things that I always laugh about, especially when I'm talking to, because now I'm slightly more educated in the mental health side, but so I always try to start off conversations when people try to talk to me about firearms. Look, at the end of this conversation, two things are going to happen. You're either going to say, Mike, you're awesome. I totally wish guns would just disappear. Or you're going to say, Mike, I have to rethink how problematic this is after what you've told me, because I trust you on that. I realize now why that's a problem. And I've actually had people that have said, I just want guns to disappear, which I love, because that means you just want good, right? You just don't want destruction around. But one of the things that we have to understand is that if we start with suicide, that's 2/3 of the firearms deaths in the United States.
Right.
Okay. That's a huge thing. I thought I was going to be Superman. I thought I was going to stop mass shootings. They pushed me to suicide. I realized why.
Yeah.
You're taking a huge number out if you do that. Second thing is if we keep saying, well, the rest is gang violence, that means we have to go into underprivileged, underserved communities. Let's start there as well. There's plenty of people in the firearms industry that are doing real work. Maj Touré from Black Guns Matter. He goes into Compton. He goes into Chicago. He teaches de-escalation. He teaches you how to carry a firearm. If you're going to carry, he teaches you firearm safety, even if you're carrying illegal.
Yeah.
There are people that care about humanity, right? And that's what we got to get back to. What I'm trying to do is create a more socially conscious 2A. That's where I want to go.
Gotcha.
I love it. And I think that's where I want to bring us to a conclusion with that message, and with the purpose of having Walk the Talk America on here. it is my desire, and I think I speak for Nick on this, as I always do. I think
That seems to be the
100% of my opinions you share. I'll just throw that out there. No, it's fine. Just go.
Do I even have opinions? I didn't realize that until
I haven't
now
given
that
you
I
them.
had-
Hold
Oh,
on.
all right,
Listen
yeah.
to it first.
Write them down.
Yeah. So I believe that it is our view, and we want to see any person who might be struggling with depression, with anxiety, with paranoia, the very factors that the FBI report said 60-something% of active shooters had experienced in the previous year to their crime. I want to see anybody who's in that situation be unafraid to get help. It's okay to get help. And Mike, I think that you and I share that passion, which is why you put these leaflets in the boxes of a gun, so that if that gun happened to have been purchased by a person who could become dangerous and is suffering, they see that it's okay to get help, and they're getting a clue as to where to go. And they're hearing that not from an outsider of their 2A community, but by an insider, a fellow gun advocate who's saying, hey, fella, hey, ma'am, don't be scared of this. This is something that we can agree on. I think that that's very valuable, and I think that that's a useful thing. And, I'll be honest with both of you. I think I've struggled in this news cycle. I think I've struggled with it because it seems like when these shootings happen, there is a scramble to find anything besides the gun that could possibly be to blame. And I think that's the only reason at the beginning of the show, Nick and I said, we're not a political show, it's a mental health show. And the accidental reality of us having to comment on a news cycle is because the President of the United States got up and said, hey, everybody, don't fear guns, fear mental illness. That's what did this. That didn't just fly in the face of what we have seen in our own treatment of our patients. It flew in the face of the FBI report on active shooters, which we have covered on this show. And Nick and I've said this in episode 26, we were second responders to the October 1 shooting in Las Vegas. And we saw the terror in people's eyes as we were trying to de-escalate them and restore sanity to a panicked and grief-stricken city. And so this is in a very personal sense something that we bear the burden of and that we care very deeply about. But I will leave off the table my personal views and how I might vote when it comes to where we draw that line, as Nick alluded to, what weapons can be included on the table, what weapons might be defensive weapons for your home, what weapons might be offensive weapons that are for war. I'll step back from that because I think the area that we have mutual agreement on is that we want to see hurting people get help, and we don't want to see anybody afraid of a therapist. And I think that's something we can all shake hands on.
Oh, absolutely. 1,000%.
Great. Well, Michael, Walk the Talk America. If somebody wants to find out more, if they want to support your work, how can they do that? Where can they go?
Social media, it's at Walk the Talk US. We're very friendly. If you have questions, it tells a 1-year story.
Oh, wonderful.
Instagram, Twitter.
Okay, and then the
Facebook.
website is, if I'm reading this correctly, is WTTA.org.
Yep.
Easy
or you go
peasy.
to walktotalkamerica.org. So.
Okay.
Yep. And then if you add /love at the end of that takes you
/love,
to a screening that you can do. And there's also a link there to the National Suicide Hotline as well.
Yeah. So if you are a gun owner or a gun advocate, you do not have to be afraid of therapists. Nick and I are real-life licensed therapists. We will not take your weapons. We just want to make sure that you are living your best life, and there's no need for you to suffer. You can come in and you can get help. That's okay to do. And if you are out there and you have ever experienced mental illness, you are not the threat to our nation. You are not the problem either. And so it's very important that you know and that the world know that mental illness is not something people need to fear. It's not something that ought to be stigmatized. It is not the cause of mass shootings in America. And I think if we can get both of those hands to shake in the middle, we could probably help a lot of hurting people. And, of course, our hearts also go out to all the victims in El Paso and in Ohio. And we just continue to just hope and pray for all of you and continue to urge all listeners to find their way to increase their involvement in the system to make sure that we're all having accountability with these conversations. I think that's the most appropriate thing we can do. Mm-hmm. So anyway, Mike, thanks so much for joining us on Pod Therapy. We're grateful for you, man. Again, guys, that's WTTA.org, WTTA.org, or WalkTheTalkAmerica.org. Thanks again, Mike.
Thank you for having me. You guys are awesome.
We are awesome.
You are. You definitely are.
All right.
All right, that's all the time we've got for this week's episode. We want to thank Scott at Level 9 Studios for hosting us this week. Thanks to all those who contribute to our show today. We really appreciate it. Remember, pod therapy isn't something you should keep all to yourselves. Help us reach others by opening this episode's description in your podcast app and copying and pasting the link provided into your social media. Don't forget, you can find us on Facebook.com/PodTherapy, on Twitter at PodTherapyGuys, and now on Patreon.com/therapy.
Do you want to submit a question to the show? Ask anonymously at www.podtherapy.net or email us at podtherapyguys@gmail.com. I'm Nick Tangeman.
I'm Nick Tangeman too. Thanks, and we'll see you for your appointment next week.